Tonight, we're diving deep into the history of our ancestors, the masters of surviving freezing winters with primitive tools. From covering themselves in animal fat to creating the coziest campsites, they knew it all. So grab a hot drink or close your eyes and prepare to journey back in time. Before we begin tonight's journey back in time, I'd love for you to do something small to help us grow this cozy little community. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy this kind of slow storytelling. And in the comments, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I read every single one. Now make yourself comfortable. Maybe you're in bed. Maybe you're curled up on the couch. Maybe you're just letting your mind unwind. Either way, let's go way, way back together. Back to a time when survival meant something very different than it does today. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of wind howling outside a rock shelter. The air bites at your skin. The fire you tended all night is just a faint glow, and snow has drifted in under the overhang. There's no central heating, no jacket, no bed, just animal hides, a smoldering fire, and the clever instincts passed down through generations of your people. This is winter in the Ice Age, the kind of cold that cracks bones and silences the forest. Yet somehow our prehistoric ancestors endured, not just once, but over and over, for tens of thousands of years. Tonight we'll explore exactly how they did it, not with vague guesses or broad generalizations, but by looking at the very real tools, shelters, habits, and relationships that kept them alive when the world outside was frozen solid. One of the most vital keys to surviving these brutal winters was clothing, but not just any clothing. Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens had no sewing needles for much of their existence. Instead, they wore simple hides, scraped clean of flesh with stone tools, then stretched and dried, fastened together with thongs or sinew, sometimes held in place with bone toggles or leather cords. Over time, though, they developed more advanced tailoring skills. Archaeologists have found small bone needles dating back around 40,000 years, possibly invented by Homo sapiens and used to stitch together multiple layers of fur and hide. These tailored garments, layered for insulation, made a profound difference. Think of them as the earliest parkas, customized to the body, flexible for movement, and built for survival. But clothing alone wasn't enough. Shelter was everything. Natural caves and rock overhangs were obvious choices, providing protection from wind, snow, and predators. But early humans didn't just huddle inside them passively. They transformed these spaces. Ash layers reveal that fires were kept burning continuously in some sites, like those found in the Dordogne region of France. Smoke-blackened ceilings and charcoal-rich floors show that they mastered the art of long-term fire maintenance, possibly using slow-burning woods or burying embers in ashes to keep them alive overnight. In more open areas, they built huts, structures made from mammoth bones and hides, with entryways carefully positioned away from prevailing winds. In Ukraine, massive rings of mammoth bones arranged in circles suggest early winter dwellings, not just functional, but remarkably deliberate. Another tool in their survival kit was knowledge, a kind of collective, generational wisdom passed down through wordless teaching. Neanderthals, once thought to be less intelligent, are now known to have had sophisticated survival strategies. They migrated seasonally, following herds, and moving between summer and winter camps. Some of these camps were located in lower elevations, or valleys, that stayed relatively warmer and shielded from wind. Food caching, hiding supplies of meat or fat in cold storage, might have been practiced. The remains of large hunted animals were sometimes found in pits or natural crevices, perhaps intentionally placed to last through the lean months. These were not people simply enduring winter. They were actively planning for it. And then there was fire, the thread that runs through almost every scene of Ice Age life. Making fire wasn't easy. For a long time, it was likely carried from natural sources, lightning strikes, burning trees, and protected carefully. Later, the use of flint and pyrite to spark fire became more common. Experimental archaeology shows that even with Stone Age tools, a skilled person can create fire in under 5 minutes. Once made, Fire was more than heat. It dried clothing, smoked meat, hardened spear tips, and lit the darkness. It may even have brought people together in ways that strengthened group survival. Huddled close to the flames, stories could be shared, plans made, wounds treated. Fire was not just a tool, it was a center of culture. And when the cold was at its worst, when snow sealed the entrance of a cave and frost crept through every crack, human warmth mattered most. Anthropologists believe early humans slept close together in shared bedding areas. Fossilized impressions of grass and furs suggest layered sleeping nests. Body heat was pooled, preserved. Babies and children were nestled between adults. This kind of intimate co-sleeping would have been not just comforting, but absolutely essential. The cold could kill silently and quickly, but together, people made it through. Not always, not easily, but often enough that we are here today telling their story. Even with all these survival strategies, the body itself had to do a lot of the work. Cold climates leave their mark on human anatomy, and over generations, natural selection favored traits that helped retain heat. Neanderthals, for instance, were short and stocky compared to modern humans. Their limbs were compact, reducing surface area and conserving body warmth more efficiently. This is consistent with what's known as Allen's rule, a principle in biology that explains how animals in cold environments tend to evolve shorter limbs and appendages. Their wide noses were once thought to help warm cold air before it entered the lungs, a theory now debated but still compelling. These weren't just random traits. They were adaptations shaped by endless winters, ice-locked valleys, and nights that could stretch on for 16 hours or more. Food was another silent battleground. In cold seasons, calories meant survival, and not just any calories. Fat was gold. Animal fat is dense in energy and essential for thermoregulation. Archaeological sites show that Ice Age humans prioritized fatty prey. Mammoths, reindeer, woolly rhinoceroses. Bones were cracked open for marrow. Hides were kept for warmth, and sometimes large animals were butchered and stored in icy conditions, almost like prehistoric refrigeration. In some cases, they may have returned to the kill site weeks or even months later. Evidence from places like the Schoningen spears in Germany, wooden hunting tools preserved in peat, shows they were effective hunters, even in bitter cold. These hunts were not reckless. They were strategic, cooperative, and likely required intense physical endurance in frigid landscapes. But what about when the hunt failed? What did they do then? There's growing evidence that Ice Age humans had more diverse diets than we once assumed. They gathered plant foods, even in winter. In some areas, they dug under the snow for starchy roots and bulbs. Pine nuts, acorns, and hazelnuts could be stored from warmer seasons. Charred seeds and roasted grains found at ancient hearths point to a resourcefulness we're only beginning to fully appreciate. They may have used hot stones to cook in pits, creating slow underground ovens that softened tough plant fibers and made them digestible. These weren't mere scavengers. They were experimental cooks, seasonal foragers, and keen observers of their environment. And sometimes, they weren't entirely alone. There's a fascinating and still evolving theory that humans may have followed wolves, or more accurately, that wolves followed humans. The idea is that mutual cooperation between early humans and proto-dogs began around this time, during cold seasons, when both species benefited from shared proximity. Wolves could have helped track prey or alert people to predators. Humans, in turn, may have offered leftover scraps. Over many generations, this relationship could have evolved into one of the earliest examples of animal domestication. In brutal winters, such bonds might have meant the difference between death and survival. A four-legged companion near the fire wasn't just emotional comfort, it was added security. Shelter construction, too, showed surprising innovation. In areas where wood was scarce, bones became architecture. In the snowy plains of what is now Ukraine and Russia, circular structures made from mammoth bones, some over 15 meters in diameter, were once thought to be ritualistic, but many archaeologists now believe they served a very practical function. Covered with hides, insulated with snow or earth, and built with entry tunnels to reduce wind exposure. These homes weren't just impressive, they were warm. Inside, they likely featured central hearths, storage pits, and even separate sleeping areas. One structure contained nearly 150 individual mammoth bones, collected and arranged with care. Think about that for a moment. These weren't cave people haphazardly surviving. They were engineers of warmth and endurance. As winter dragged on, communities had to remain connected. Isolation was dangerous. It meant fewer hands to gather wood, to prepare hides, to hunt. In places like the Gravettian culture of Europe, which flourished between 33,000 and 22,000 years ago, evidence suggests people gathered seasonally, perhaps to share resources, trade goods, or seek mates. These were not chaotic encounters. Shell beads, carved figurines, and patterns of hearth placement indicate organized, even ceremonial gatherings. And during the coldest months, those meetings may have offered more than just supplies. They provided psychological warmth. Shared songs, stories, or dances around the fire would have helped people endure not just physically, but emotionally, because survival wasn't only about the body, it was also about spirit. Sometimes, survival meant looking at the landscape in ways we might never consider today. The terrain itself could offer shelter, not just caves and cliffs, but deeper refuges. In colder regions, humans took advantage of natural formations like sinkholes and crevices that held warmer air pockets. Even snow could be used as insulation. Like modern-day igloos, compacted snow shelters trap heat surprisingly well, and some evidence hints that humans understood these principles intuitively, even before they had the language to explain them. Pits were dug into the earth, lined with insulating materials like grasses or moss, and covered with hides and branches. It's possible that some families built semi-subterranean shelters, which remained above freezing even in sub-zero temperatures. The land itself, when understood, could become a kind of silent partner in survival. Then there was the importance of firewood, a detail easy to overlook, but absolutely central to winter life. Gathering wood wasn't just a matter of picking up sticks, it was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and strategic. Dead wood burns poorly in extreme cold unless dried thoroughly, and green wood creates smoke that can suffocate enclosed spaces. Some groups likely stored dry wood under overhangs or inside shelters. Charcoal remains found at ancient sites show they selectively burned different types of wood depending on their purpose. Slow-burning hardwoods for heat, smoky pine for meat preservation, and softer woods for kindling. Even the ability to recognize which trees offered resin for waterproofing, hides, or preserving tools was passed down like sacred knowledge. Each piece of the forest had a role, and they knew it. Tools played a quiet but crucial part in every winter day. The hand axe, one of the oldest human tools, was used to butcher meat, cut hides, break bones, and shape wood. In the cold, fine motor skills deteriorate quickly, so tools had to be reliable, sharp, and easy to wield. Some were hafted, attached to handles, using rawhide, sinew, or even birch bark tar, which is sticky and waterproof. This innovation may have allowed for more efficient cutting and scraping, reducing the time spent exposed to the elements. In northern Europe, flint knapping waste, the leftover shards from making stone blades, has been found clustered near hearths, suggesting tool-making was done close to the fire, in warmth, with others nearby. These were not solo survivors hacking their way through winter. They were artisans, improving tools, refining techniques, teaching the next generation by demonstration. And still, there were times when even preparation wasn't enough. Frostbite, illness, and injury could strike suddenly. In those moments, the community's strength mattered most. Burial sites from the Paleolithic period suggest that people didn't abandon the weak or the ill. Some skeletons show signs of long-term care, injuries that had healed improperly but clearly had not been fatal. There's one famous case, Shanidar I, a Neanderthal male found in Iraq's Shanidar cave. He had a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and evidence of a painful limp, and yet he lived to old age. Someone fed him, protected him, and kept him warm through many winters. That tells us something profound. Our ancestors weren't just survivors, they were caretakers. Compassion, even in a frozen world, was part of the human story. Winter also reshaped how people thought about time. When daylight was scarce, they relied more on the rhythms of fire, stars, and the moon. Some archaeologists believe that carvings on bones or cave walls may represent lunar calendars or seasonal tracking. In places like the Cave of La Marche in France, etchings of animals and human figures appear alongside abstract notches and patterns, possibly a record of migration or seasonal cycles. This kind of mental mapping would have been essential for planning, knowing when to leave a camp, when to prepare for birth, when the reindeer would return. Timekeeping, in its earliest form, may have been born out of winter, the need to endure it, to predict it, and to emerge from it alive. And through it all, there was art. Even in the coldest environments, people made time for expression. The famous cave paintings of Chauvet and Altamira were likely created during colder periods, rich with images of animals, not just hunted, but revered. Why spend precious energy on painting when survival is at stake? Maybe because art was survival, it gave meaning to struggle, connected generations, and brought beauty into a harsh world. Some pigments were made by grinding minerals with fat or marrow, applied with brushes made from animal hair, or even blown through hollowed bones. These weren't idle scribbles. They were symbols, memory, perhaps even prayer. Silent voices echoing across frozen time. The human ability to adapt didn't stop at tools or shelter. It extended to the very structure of daily life. In winter, time slowed down. Days grew shorter, and so did activity. Unlike today, there was no pressure to be constantly busy. Rest was a survival tactic. Energy conservation became a daily practice. People likely spent long hours indoors, crouched near firelight, wrapped in furs, reducing movement to preserve calories. Some researchers believe this seasonal pacing mirrored animal behavior, a kind of human semi-hibernation. It's not that they slept through winter, but rather that they moved less, ate more fat, and focused on essential tasks. Even storytelling might have served this need, a mental journey when the body needed stillness. In the quiet months, imagination had room to breathe, and in that stillness, spiritual beliefs may have taken deeper root. The long, dark winters invited reflection about life, death, ancestors, and forces beyond the visible world. Burial sites with red ochre, animal bones arranged with care, or symbolic artifacts suggest that even tens of thousands of years ago, people honored the dead in places like Dolní Vistanica, in what is now the Czech Republic. Archaeologists uncovered a triple burial, 3 young individuals placed side by side, one with a twisted spinal condition. Their bodies were carefully arranged, covered in red pigment, and buried beneath mammoth bones. What kind of winter did they endure? What stories were told about them around the fire? These rites tell us that survival wasn't just physical. The cold shaped beliefs, in spirits, in ancestors, in the mystery of what lies beyond. We also know that winter created a stronger sense of group identity. It was us against the cold. In small bands, trust mattered. Every person had a role. Some tracked animals, some prepared hides, others tended fires or watched children. And the elders, they were libraries of survival knowledge. Long before writing, information was stored in people. An elder might know where the ice was thin on a certain lake, or which root to chew when your tooth ached in the cold. Preserving those individuals meant preserving generations of wisdom. It's no surprise that in many burial sites, older individuals appear to have been respected, buried with care, often accompanied by tools or ornaments that might have belonged to them for decades. The winter didn't erase age, it elevated it. The presence of children adds yet another layer to this story. How were the young kept warm, safe, and alive through the coldest months? Likely they were swaddled in layers of fur, held close to the body, kept in the warmest parts of the shelter. In some cultures, infants might have been carried in slings worn beneath outer garments, sharing body heat with a parent. Play would have looked different in winter. Quieter, more imaginative, Small toys have been found at Paleolithic sites, carved animals, little figurines made from ivory or clay. These weren't distractions. They were tools for learning, comfort, and connection. In a world where danger was everywhere, these small gestures of care remind us that love was part of survival too. And through each storm, each frostbitten morning, the people adapted. Sometimes they moved. Nomadic bands didn't wait for the cold to deepen. They left early, following herds, retreating to lower elevations or south-facing slopes where the snow melted faster. Migration routes became etched into memory. Some were no doubt passed on in song or gesture, repeated year after year until they became instinct. This movement wasn't random. It was coordinated, informed by generations of observation. Archaeological layers show seasonal patterns. Sites occupied in winter, then abandoned by spring. When to go, where to go, how many days to prepare. These were decisions with life or death consequences, and they got them right often enough that the story continued. What might surprise you most is how much warmth came not from furs or fires, but from each other. Physical closeness was survival, but so was emotional closeness. During winter, people had to cooperate. They had to trust that others would pull their weight, that food would be shared fairly, that no one would hoard firewood or tools. Conflict could be deadly. Harmony wasn't just an ideal, it was a necessity. In that sense, winter wasn't just a test of the body, it was a test of the group, and time after time, across continents and millennia, humans found a way to pass it. The cold didn't just shape what people did, it shaped how they thought. Imagine spending months each year surrounded by white landscapes, dim skies, and a stillness broken only by the creak of trees or the snap of frozen branches. That kind of silence sharpens the senses. It also sharpens memory. Some anthropologists believe that the repetition of winter survival led to early forms of pattern recognition, an ability to remember seasonal cues, animal migrations, and environmental shifts. Over time, this likely developed into storytelling and eventually teaching. When someone knew how to read the tracks of a snow-covered forest or where to find the last patch of edible moss beneath a rock, that knowledge had to be passed on, not just once, but precisely. Cold seasons may have been the birthplace of careful observation. Even the way people used light in winter was different. In total darkness, the flicker of a single flame becomes sacred. Stone lamps fueled by animal fat have been found in ancient shelters, their blackened surfaces still etched with the marks of use. These simple devices extended the day, just enough to cook, repair a garment, or whisper a story to a child. And light wasn't only practical, it was symbolic. Fire marked the center of life. Around it, people gathered to eat, sleep, laugh, grieve. Shadows cast on stone walls may have inspired some of the earliest forms of art and myth. In winter, when the world outside felt endless and hostile, the small world within the fire's glow became everything. Warmth, light, scent, all of it concentrated into a shared human moment. And then, of course, came the thaw. Each year, after surviving the long siege of cold, there came a moment, subtle, perhaps barely noticed, when the wind shifted. Snow turned to slush, birds returned. Ice cracked open to reveal flowing water. The relief must have been overwhelming. For prehistoric people, spring wasn't just a new season. It was a reward. It meant survival. Those first signs, a bud pushing through frozen soil, the return of light before supper, must have felt like a miracle, and with them came movement. Camps were dismantled, tools sharpened, plans made. The shift from winter to spring was a transformation not just of the landscape, but of the spirit. You had endured, and now there was work to do again. Interestingly, the memory of winter and the experience of surviving it may have contributed to the shaping of early human identity. Think about it. When you've shared months of scarcity, of hardship, of cold, your bond with others deepens. You don't forget who brought you food when you were weak, who stayed awake to keep the fire alive, who offered you a place in their furs. That kind of shared history becomes more than just a memory. It becomes culture. Oral traditions, gestures, superstitions. Many may have originated from cold season experiences, retold year after year. A crackling sound in the forest might mean a certain predator. The color of the morning sky might warn of an oncoming storm. These weren't just observations. They were wisdom, paid for by experience and shared because it saved lives. The evidence of all this still lies buried, not in books or scrolls, but in layers of ash, in bones wrapped in ochre, in fragments of worn tools left behind in caves. Archaeologists piece together these moments like detectives of deep time. A fur-wrapped child laid in a grave with mammoth ivory beads, a circle of stones blackened by smoke, a piece of antler carved with marks that may represent the waxing and waning moon. We'll never know the full conversations, the jokes, the tears, the dreams, but we can see the shape of them, like footprints in old snow. And what's perhaps most extraordinary is not that these people survived the cold, but that they did it with ingenuity, resilience, and even beauty. Because through it all, they didn't just endure winter. They lived through it. They loved. They created. They adapted. And in doing so, they built the foundation for every warm house, every shared meal, every campfire story told today. Their blood runs in us. Their struggles echo in our bones. And when we step outside into the crisp air of a modern winter and pull a coat tighter around ourselves, somewhere deep in the background of our DNA is the memory of what it once took to simply make it through the night. Sometimes survival depended on noticing the smallest details, things most of us wouldn't think twice about today. For example, the placement of a sleeping area inside a shelter wasn't random. It had to be near enough to the fire to stay warm, but not so close that sparks could catch on furs or hair. Some groups may have built low stone barriers around fires to redirect heat, or used heated stones tucked into bedding to keep warm overnight. Experiments by modern bushcrafters show that if a flat stone is heated next to a fire and then wrapped in leather or fur, it can retain heat for hours, something Ice Age families might have figured out through trial, error, and shared wisdom. These quiet solutions, invisible to the modern eye, were the difference between frostbite and comfort. Even bedding was engineered with care. In South African rock shelters like Sibutu Cave, scientists discovered layered plant bedding over 70,000 years old, stacked mats of sedges, grasses, and aromatic leaves that naturally repelled insects. The layering wasn't accidental. It showed intent, and regular replacement suggests maintenance routines. In colder climates, similar principles likely applied, using evergreen boughs, dry moss, and even animal hair to insulate sleeping areas. Bedding was sometimes placed on raised platforms of bones, rocks, or woven wood, keeping it off the frozen ground. The care taken in these sleeping arrangements speaks volumes. These weren't just resting places, they were refuges, warm, protected spaces carved out against the cold and darkness where people could rest, dream, and heal. What's fascinating is how these practices likely varied depending on location. Not all cavemen lived in caves. In fact, many preferred portable shelters that allowed seasonal movement. In open tundra or steppe, caves were rare. Here, circular tents made of wooden frames and hide coverings may have resembled early versions of yurts. In colder periods, snow was packed around the outer walls for insulation, and a central fire vented through a smoke hole. Evidence from Eastern European sites suggests that hearths were sometimes dug into the ground, with smoke channeled through shallow tunnels. This would have allowed for heating without overwhelming smoke, a natural ventilation system built without blueprints. The creativity and experimentation that went into keeping warm is astonishing. It wasn't uniform. It was adaptive. And while the material conditions of winter survival were intense, so was the mental resilience. In long months of darkness and scarcity, boredom could be just as dangerous as cold. Keeping the mind occupied helped prevent despair. Children were taught games, sometimes played with carved dice or knucklebones. Adults sharpened tools, repaired gear, shaped ornaments, and prepared for future hunts. Music may have played a role here too. The world's oldest known musical instruments, bone flutes from Germany, date back over 40,000 years. Played near firelight in the deep silence of winter, their eerie notes might have brought comfort, memory, or even ritual. Music, like fire, was warmth in a different form, a warmth that wrapped around the spirit. Food rituals were another source of comfort and connection. In a harsh season, even a simple meal could feel like a feast. Roasting meat over a shared fire wasn't just about nourishment, it was about presence. Shared meals built trust. In some cultures, the act of giving food, even a small portion, may have had spiritual significance. There's evidence that certain parts of animals, like hearts or livers, were offered symbolically or buried with the dead. These actions hint at a worldview where survival wasn't purely practical, it was also sacred. The cold may have threatened the body, but rituals, songs, and symbols reminded people of something larger, a reason to keep going together. And in the heart of all this survival was one quiet but powerful idea: continuity. Winter was hard, but it wasn't forever. People lived with the hope and memory of spring. Each cold season endured was part of a cycle. Children were born in winter shelters. Elders told stories of storms they had survived. Hunters remembered the trails that would open again once the snow thawed. These weren't just frozen, desperate months. They were part of a rhythm that shaped everything, from how people built their shelters to how they saw the stars. The ancient cold didn't break them. It shaped them. It made them human. The rhythm of winter meant that daily decisions were made with extreme care, often far in advance. One such decision was when to hunt and what to risk. The deeper the snow, the more dangerous it became to pursue large game. Injuries from slips, cold exposure, or even broken bones during a hunt could easily be fatal, but the need for protein and fat didn't disappear. So in the harshest stretches, smaller prey became more important. Hares, ptarmigans, even fish trapped beneath river ice were sought out with patience and skill. Snares made from twisted sinew or gut could be set in narrow paths where animals passed. Fish could be coaxed into holes in the ice and speared or caught with bone hooks. These strategies required quiet attention, an ability to read the land and the season, and a deep memory of what had worked in winters past. Meanwhile, the role of women and of elders was often vital in these cold months. While the image of the rugged male hunter dominates much of the prehistoric imagination, the reality was more nuanced. Gathering, processing, mending, teaching, child-rearing, all continued during winter. Scraping hides until soft, stitching clothing with bone needles, drying meat strips near the fire, boiling bone broth rich in nutrients. These were tasks that sustained the group, and older individuals, less able to hunt, passed on essential skills through demonstration and storytelling. Even the choice of where to place firewood or how to dry sinew for thread required experience. Winter wasn't a time for individualism. It was a time for interdependence, and every person mattered. In this closeness, emotions ran deep. Grief in the cold could feel heavier, and the loss of a single person could reshape an entire group's chances. Archaeological sites sometimes contain multiple burials from the same period, suggesting that winters may have brought illness or food shortages. Yet even in death, there was dignity. Bodies were often carefully arranged, sometimes with offerings, a necklace of pierced shells, a tool they had used in life, ochre staining the earth around them. These gestures were not practical. They were symbolic. They suggest memory, mourning, and the belief that even in the face of cold and darkness, life had meaning. Winter stripped life to its barest elements, and in doing so, may have made humans more aware of how precious it was. We also see in the archaeological record that these early humans were not always isolated. Trade routes, some stretching for hundreds of kilometers, existed between groups. In the cold months, long-distance travel was reduced, but connections were maintained, sometimes through emissaries, sometimes through planned seasonal gatherings, when conditions allowed. Beads made from Mediterranean shells have been found in Central Europe. Tools made from flint that originated far away show up in the hands of hunters who never lived near the source. These connections weren't just about goods, they were about information, marriage alliances, shared songs, and perhaps even shared rituals. Winter didn't end community. It may have deepened it by making every contact more intentional, more valuable. As humans spread into new and colder regions, from the Siberian tundra to the mountain valleys of Central Asia, they continued to innovate. Clothing became more specialized. Inner layers of soft fur, outer layers of thick hide, sewn tightly and tailored to each body. Some groups used snowshoes, made from woven branches and sinew, to move more easily across powdery drifts. Others developed early goggles made from bone or wood to shield their eyes from snow glare, a real danger in bright frozen landscapes. Even the design of weapons shifted with the seasons. In winter, throwing spears could be difficult due to heavy clothing and frozen fingers, so short stabbing spears or bone-tipped clubs might have become more common. The cold didn't freeze human creativity, it forced it to evolve. And still, through all this, people found moments of joy. Children played with carved toys or slid down snow-covered slopes. Hunters joked around fires, even after long, silent days. Songs echoed inside shelters. Couples shared warmth under shared hides. Winter might have brought scarcity and danger, but it also brought stillness, closeness, and reflection. Those long nights under the stars, when breath rose in clouds and firelight danced across stone walls, were not just scenes of hardship, they were scenes of life, deeply human, endlessly complex, and full of quiet strength. One of the most remarkable things about early humans is how quickly they adapted to such a wide range of environments, from the ice-covered valleys of northern Europe to the glacial edges of Siberia and beyond. People modified their survival strategies in tune with the land. In some regions, winter might mean snow and deep freeze. In others, it was endless rain and chilling winds. The way these early communities responded tells us something crucial. They weren't simply reacting to winter. They were preparing for it. They studied it, remembered it, and changed their behavior based on its patterns. This required memory, collaboration, and forward thinking, traits that still define who we are today. Language likely played a key role in this process. While we can't hear their words, many researchers believe that spoken language, even if basic, was in use well before the Ice Age. In winter, where group cohesion was critical, the ability to communicate efficiently could mean the difference between cooperation and chaos. Simple instructions like bring wood, watch child, or snow coming would have helped distribute tasks. Beyond the practical, language may have helped preserve traditions. This cave is safe. Hunt here when the moon is full. These roots make you warm. Around the fire, with darkness pressing in, language would also have created comfort. Stories, songs, and shared memories passed from mouth to mouth, generation after generation. We also begin to see more symbolic thinking emerge in this period, not just in cave art or burial rituals, but in how people interacted with the natural world. Some anthropologists believe that animals held deeper meaning beyond being prey. In certain sites, cave walls are filled with animals that were rarely, if ever, hunted. Lions, owls, even abstract symbols. Could these have been seen as spirits, guardians, or omens? In winter especially, when life and death felt closer together. The idea of a hidden world, one filled with powers beyond the visible, might have brought a kind of order to the chaos. Rituals performed before a hunt, or markings carved into bones, could have been acts of faith in a world that was, for most of the year, frozen and silent. And then there were the sounds of winter, the wind whipping across rock faces, the crack of tree limbs under weight of snow, the dull thump of snow falling from a branch. These would have been constant, but so were the sounds of people, the scrape of hide being cleaned, the low rhythm of someone sharpening a blade, the rustle of children stirring under furs, even the sound of a fire. In the absence of the noise we now take for granted, every sound was amplified, meaningful. A twig snapping outside could mean danger. The soft snore of a sleeping companion could mean safety. Sound wasn't just background. It was information, emotion, and memory. Food, too, evolved with the season. When meat was scarce or frozen, people had to get creative. Pounded bone paste, made by grinding bones and mixing them with melted fat, was rich in calories and easy to store. Ice pits, or natural crevices, were used to preserve meat, a method that worked surprisingly well in cold climates. Fat rendered from animals was poured into stone bowls or skin pouches, then eaten cold or warmed slightly near the fire. Some cultures may have made early versions of pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, pressed into dense cakes that could last for months. These weren't luxuries, they were fuel, and every morsel was hard-earned. Finally, there's the question of time. Not just hours and days, but seasons and years. In the dark heart of winter, how did people keep track of time's passing? In some caves, markings appear to follow lunar cycles. Others seem to count days, or the phases of animal migration. But it wasn't just about counting. It was about orientation. Knowing that spring was coming, that winter would end, gave people a psychological anchor. These early calendars weren't calendars as we know them. They were reminders. They told people, hold on a little longer. The sun will return. The herds will move again. Life will start over. And in the depth of winter, that knowledge may have been the most powerful tool of all. In the heart of the Ice Age, one of the most surprising realities was how much planning had to go into even the simplest activities. Something as routine as fetching water could become an ordeal. Rivers froze. Snow had to be melted, and ice needed to be chipped from rocks with stone tools. Carrying water was no easy feat either. It required containers, often made from animal stomachs, bladders, or tightly sewn hides sealed with resin. These early vessels weren't just improvised, they were engineered. Stitching had to be waterproof. Seams had to hold under the weight of melted snow. In places with permafrost, the only water came from snow or from streams hidden under thick ice. Gathering it was a daily necessity, and every drop mattered. And as vital as water was, maintaining fire may have been even more crucial. Starting a fire from scratch wasn't guaranteed, so it's likely that fires were carefully guarded, their embers banked under ash overnight to keep them alive. Children may have been tasked with feeding coals, keeping flames going while adults hunted or gathered. In emergencies, embers could be carried from camp to camp in small, heat-resistant containers. Perhaps a hollowed bone, wrapped in hide and ash insulated. These were the original firekeepers, not just of flame but of continuity. To lose fire was to lose warmth, light, cooking, and protection. Fire was central to survival, and tending it was a sacred responsibility. Cold also shaped how people used their bodies. In freezing conditions, exposure could cause dangerous drops in body temperature within minutes. So movement had to be intentional. Clothing had to be layered, breathable, and tight enough to retain warmth without trapping moisture. Some groups may have lined their garments with moss or fine grasses for extra insulation. Snow boots were fashioned from hide and fur with added stuffing to reduce heat loss through the feet. And hands, our most essential tools, were protected with mitt-like coverings that allowed fingers to stay close together. These weren't crude attempts at warmth. They were refined through centuries of trial, adjustment, and memory. Survival taught people not just what to wear, but how to wear it. And yet, even with preparation, accidents happened. A broken bone or deep cut in winter was dangerous. Infection could spread quickly, and healing was slowed by the cold. But evidence suggests that people cared for one another. In some caves, tools resembling early splints have been found, lengths of bone or wood with signs of fiber wrapping, possibly used to immobilize limbs. Antiseptic plants, such as yarrow or mosses with natural antibacterial properties, were sometimes found near burial sites. Whether used consciously for medicine or instinctively, these plants may have helped treat wounds or ease inflammation. In cold months, when movement slowed and daily work shifted indoors, There may have been time and purpose for healing. The community gathered close, not just for warmth, but for recovery. The constant presence of danger didn't prevent creativity. Even in the bleakest seasons, people made things, tools, art, ornaments, and more. In some winter shelters, small carved animals made of ivory or bone have been discovered, delicately crafted with surprising realism. Were they toys, talismans, practice pieces? We don't know, but their existence tells us something essential. Humans never stopped imagining. In a world where survival took up most waking hours, the act of making something, simply because it was beautiful or meaningful, stands out. Perhaps creativity was a form of resistance against the cold, a way to hold on to joy when the outside world gave so little of it. The cold may have closed people in, but it also brought them together. These months were intimate. Privacy was almost impossible. Sounds carried. Eyes watched. And yet, rather than break under that closeness, many communities seemed to thrive on it. Bonds were formed that went beyond survival. They shaped culture, behavior, and belief. You didn't just know who would guard the fire or fetch snow for melting. You knew how they moved, how they sighed in sleep, how they looked when spring sunlight returned. Winter made people part of each other's stories, and those stories, once shared, lived on, long after the snow melted. The sound of wind rattling through bare branches must have been a near constant background during winter. And it wasn't just noise, it was a messenger. Experienced elders could probably tell from the tone of the wind whether a storm was coming, whether the air was warming slightly, or if snow was about to fall. People became intimate with nature's cues, the flight patterns of birds, the shifting texture of ice beneath the feet, the smell of the air. All of it fed into decisions: when to move, when to stay, when to hunt, when to wait. In a world without thermometers or forecasts, the body and mind were the forecast. Attunement to nature wasn't mystical, it was essential. Even the animals that humans depended on were part of this rhythm. Take reindeer, for example, an animal that not only provided meat, but also bones for tools, hides for clothing, and sinew for thread. Reindeer were highly seasonal in their movement. Winter herds could be tracked across wide, open landscapes. Groups often developed predictable migratory patterns. Over generations, humans learned to anticipate those movements. They didn't just chase, they planned. Sometimes they would create drive lanes, guiding animals into narrow paths or ambush points, using stone alignments or natural terrain. This kind of organized hunting required communication, patience, and a deep understanding of animal behavior. It was, in many ways, the earliest form of strategy. The tools of that strategy were constantly evolving. In colder months, when the ground was frozen solid and snow muffled movement, different weapons were used. Spear points made of bone or antler could be more flexible and less likely to shatter in cold conditions compared to brittle stone tips. Sleds or drags made from bones and hides may have helped transport meat across snowy terrain. At sites like Pinsevent in France, ancient footprints preserved in river silt suggest that people moved deliberately, often working in coordinated teams. The distribution of tools and hearths shows that winter survival wasn't scattered or improvised. It was structured, methodical, and often remarkably efficient. But the winter world wasn't all organization and silence. There must have been laughter too, moments of absurdity or warmth that broke the stillness. Imagine someone slipping on icy rock, only to burst out laughing, or a child bundled in furs, chasing after a snowflake like it was alive. There's evidence that people painted their bodies even in cold weather, not for warmth, but for identity, beauty, or ritual. Ochre powder has been found in contexts far from burial or art. Maybe someone applied red ochre to their cheeks before a hunt. Maybe it was part of a winter tradition, a way of marking the season's arrival or drawing protection from unseen forces. These gestures, so small, speak of a world where meaning was woven into survival. Sometimes, those meanings were shared across vast distances. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows that early human groups weren't isolated islands. They were nodes in a network. During warmer months, paths were forged between regions. But even in winter, the echoes of those networks remained. A tool style seen in one region might suddenly appear hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting travel or imitation. A burial practice might be replicated in distant areas. These patterns reveal something profound. People were watching each other, learning from each other. Even in the cold, ideas moved. The human ability to imitate, adapt, and refine is part of what made us so successful. Winter didn't interrupt that. It may have accelerated it. In this way, winter wasn't just a season to be survived. It was a crucible, a time when innovation, cooperation, and meaning were tested and refined. The people who made it through were not lucky. They were skilled, they were attentive, and above all, they were resilient. Their knowledge didn't come from books or schools. It came from scars, from loss, from careful listening, and from celebrating every little victory. A fire that lasted through the night, a child that stopped coughing, a thawed animal track. These moments, small as they seem, were everything. They built the foundation, not just for survival, but for human culture. In the hush of an Ice Age winter, people's relationship to the stars likely deepened, with long nights stretching for 14 or even 16 hours. The sky was a vast, cold canvas, not just overhead, but omnipresent. Without artificial light, the stars would have appeared far brighter than we can imagine today. Constellations became companions. Maybe the same patterns we now call Orion or the Pleiades guided their eyes, or marked the turning of seasons. Some researchers believe that carvings found on mammoth tusks or antler bones, notched in repeating intervals, may reflect lunar cycles. In such a frozen world, where the line between night and day blurred, keeping track of the moon may have been more than curiosity. It may have been hope. And if the sky was a kind of map, so too was the land. People moved through their winter territories with precision. Every boulder, tree, and ridge held memory. That cluster of rocks, a shelter from a storm 2 winters ago. That frozen stream, a place where reindeer fell through the ice last year. In oral cultures, landscapes are layered with meaning. You don't just walk from one place to another. You pass through memory. In winter, when new paths are buried under snow, these mental maps become lifelines. Children learned them by walking with elders, repeating names, hearing stories about who had died here or where a wolf had been seen. In a way, memory became the first kind of map-making, not drawn on hide or bark, but etched into shared minds. These shared minds were strengthened by shared labor. Daily chores in the cold were never solitary for long. One person gathered snow to melt, while another chopped kindling. A child might be sent to check on the drying meat, or turn hides hung near the fire to avoid scorching. In winter, time became circular. Tasks were repeated over and over. Rhythms became predictable, and cooperation wasn't optional. It was culture. Gender roles likely existed, but they were fluid when necessary. If the hunters were injured, someone else would have to step in. If a tool broke, the person with the steadiest hands, not necessarily the eldest or the strongest, would fix it. Flexibility was another form of intelligence, and winter required it every single day. And while survival was constant work, it also inspired moments of celebration. Anthropologists studying traditional cold-adapted cultures, such as the Sami or Chukchi, have long observed that communal storytelling and symbolic ritual often peak during the darkest months. It's not hard to imagine that ancient peoples did the same. They may have danced in tight shelters, shadows flickering on stone walls. They may have painted faces with ash or ochre, mimicking the creatures they revered or feared. Some Ice Age figurines, carved from mammoth ivory or limestone, depict animals with exaggerated features, or hybrid human-animal forms. Were these visions, totems, teaching tools for the young? No one knows for sure, but creating art during a season of scarcity shows that survival alone was never enough. Humans needed meaning. Even the most mundane items reveal this. Take beads. Thousands have been found across Europe and Asia, made of shells, bones, stones, or ivory, strung into necklaces or sewn into clothing. These weren't just decorative. They signaled identity, status, perhaps even tribal or family affiliation. Beads may have been given as gifts, passed down as heirlooms, or worn in rituals. Making a bead takes time, especially in the cold, with numb fingers and limited daylight. The fact that people still made them, still traded them, still buried their loved ones with them, speaks to a deeper need, the desire to belong. In a frozen world, beauty didn't vanish. It became a quiet form of resilience. And in this landscape of cold and silence, there must have been moments of breathtaking clarity when the clouds parted and the moon cast a silver glow on snow-covered earth. When the cold was still biting, but the fire crackled steadily, and everyone was home. When, for just a few hours, nothing was urgent, and the only sound was the slow breath of sleeping companions. Those are the moments we rarely imagine when we think of cavemen. But they were real. These were people who lived in extremes, and yet still made time for comfort, for rhythm, for memory. They didn't just survive winters. They shaped their lives around them. The harshness of winter didn't just influence how early humans lived. It shaped their entire relationship with time, death, and change. In a world where entire landscapes could vanish under snow in a matter of days, and where spring could arrive with sudden flooding and thaw, nothing felt permanent. This awareness may have been part of what made early humans so attentive to the cycles of nature. They noticed the phases of the moon, the direction of migrating herds, the patterns left behind by frost or flood. These weren't just environmental cues. They were reminders that nothing lasted forever, and that survival required constant awareness. There's a kind of humility in that. Winter didn't let anyone grow complacent. It kept people alert, responsive, and close to the earth. Within that fragility, we find evidence of unexpected sophistication, not just in physical survival, but in emotion. Some of the earliest human footprints ever discovered show adults walking alongside children in soft, wet soil. Impressions frozen in time, tens of thousands of years ago. In one famous example in modern-day France, a young child's footprints are found alongside a fire-lit torch mark deep inside a cave. What was that child doing there, in the cold dark, holding light? Were they learning, playing, helping in a ritual? The footprints are not hurried, they're confident. That tells us something important. Even in the cold, even in the dark, children were included. They weren't left behind. They were brought into the heart of things. And inside those hearts, both literal and figurative, people carried stories. We often think of the past as mute, but in truth, it was filled with voices. There would have been old stories, told year after year as the snow piled up. Stories of the animal who gave itself to the hunters, the ancestor who walked across the ice and never returned, the star that fell and started a fire. These weren't just bedtime tales. They were living frameworks, a way to understand suffering, joy, birth, and death. They helped people make sense of hunger or grief, or the strange comfort that sometimes comes with a sky full of stars. The Ice Age world was vast and often terrifying, but story made it personal. Those stories were passed down not just in words, but in marks. A row of dots scratched onto bone, a spiraling shape carved into rock, a sequence of handprints pressed into cave walls, left by children, adults, the elderly. These weren't graffiti. They were memory, legacy, perhaps even identity. One of the most haunting things ever found is a cave handprint, missing its fingers, not from injury, but intentionally made by bending the fingers inward. Was it a symbol, a game, a code? The truth is, we don't know, but someone did it. Someone in the cold, surrounded by flickering torchlight, made a conscious choice to leave a mark. That urge to be remembered, to say I was here, runs deep in all of us. Winter survival wasn't simply about technique. It was about adaptability of mind. Imagine being part of a group, deep in the cold season, and someone proposes trying something new. A different way of layering hides, a new fire-starting method, a novel hunting path. Accepting change in a world of risk takes trust. Early humans had to balance tradition with experimentation. The groups that survived were not just the strongest, they were the most willing to learn. They observed animals, tried new tools, remembered mistakes, and passed on what worked. This living memory, flexible yet grounded, was the real inheritance of Ice Age communities. They weren't stuck in their ways. They evolved, not in centuries, but in seasons. And perhaps this is what truly sets them apart. In the coldest times, in the most unforgiving environments, they didn't give up. They adapted, they shared, they remembered, and they hoped. Hope may have been the quiet engine beneath it all. Hope that spring would come. Hope that the fire would last. Hope that the story, when told again next winter, would still be worth telling. That kind of hope, forged in darkness, fed by breath and flame, has never left us. We carry it still, through our own long nights, into every morning light. Some of the most enduring legacies of Ice Age winters are found not in tools or fire pits, but in how people shaped each other. Survival in cold climates forged a kind of emotional intelligence. You had to know how to read people, not just their words, but their silences, their expressions, the way they moved or hesitated. In shelters where space was tight and emotions could run high, social harmony wasn't just pleasant, it was critical. Conflict could fracture a group when it needed unity most. So people learned to listen closely, to soothe tensions, to offer a portion of meat even when they were hungry themselves. That kind of cooperation, the subtle instinctive kind, may have been honed most sharply when the snow was thickest outside and the fire was lowest inside. Even the idea of leadership likely looked different in winter. In some moments, the strongest may have taken charge. In others, the wisest voice might have carried the most weight. The person who remembered the way through a pass, or who knew what kind of bark lit best in wet conditions. Leadership wasn't a fixed role, it moved with the needs of the group. And winter had a way of clarifying those needs. When everything froze, you needed less talk and more trust. The people who were most respected were probably those who remained calm when the wind picked up, who didn't panic when the food ran low, who kept others laughing even when the sky was gray for weeks. Authority didn't come from domination. It came from reliability, from presence. Sometimes presence meant enduring loss. Archaeological evidence tells us that not everyone survived every winter. Children's graves, individuals buried in pairs, traces of skeletal malnourishment. All of these remind us that ancient winters were not just cold, but costly. Yet even in those moments, people didn't turn away. They buried their dead with care. They marked graves with stones or pigment. Some bodies were laid on beds of soft plant matter, or covered with ivory beads, or positioned to face a certain direction. These gestures speak of love, of sorrow, of the need to say goodbye. It's humbling to realize that the human capacity for grief and the rituals we create to move through it go back so far into our shared past. The cold may have taken lives, but it didn't extinguish care, and care was a kind of legacy. Just as people learned to chip flint or stitch hide, they also learned how to comfort, how to remember, how to teach. Children were taught not just how to survive, but how to belong. Sitting by the fire, they would mimic flint knapping, listen to hunting tales, or watch someone carve an amulet from bone. Slowly, over seasons and years, those children would become caretakers themselves. That continuity of skills, of stories, of values, was the real fire that never went out. It burned through memory, through time, through community. That's what winter survival really protected. Not just the body, but the thread that tied people to one another. Some groups left behind not only tools and bones, but whole landscapes of meaning. At sites across Europe, concentric rings of stones, mammoth bones arranged in spirals, and alignments with solstices suggest that people saw winter not only as hardship, but as a sacred time. The darkest day of the year, when the sun barely rose, may have marked an important turning point. To recognize the return of light was to reaffirm life. Perhaps they danced, perhaps they sang, perhaps they sat in silence and simply watched the sun rise again. We'll never know the full ritual, but the intention is there, written in the stones, in the soot, in the symbols carved deep into cave walls. It tells us that they weren't just surviving, they were celebrating something deeper: endurance, return, rebirth. And so when we think of cavemen, it's worth reshaping that image. These weren't grunting, aimless figures huddled in caves. They were observant, social, adaptive people who met the worst of nature with the best of human instinct. They planned, they mourned, they laughed, they innovated. And each winter that they survived wasn't just a delay until spring. It was a victory of creativity over chaos, of connection over cold. Their legacy isn't buried in the past. It lives in how we still gather around fires, still tell stories through the long nights, still find each other in the dark. Across millennia, one of the least visible, yet most crucial, survival skills was observation. In winter, the land constantly shifted. Ice formed on new surfaces overnight. Wind changed the shape of snowbanks. Animals altered their habits. And people watched. They watched for thin ice by the sound it made underfoot. They noticed how frost settled differently on rocks than on grass, how snow crusted over after sunlit days, but grew soft again beneath moonlight. This kind of knowledge wasn't written down. It was learned through experience, then passed from hand to hand, story to story. You can imagine a child walking beside an elder, being shown how a single print in snow could reveal the weight, gait, and urgency of an animal long gone. The cold sharpened more than bones. It sharpened minds. We often imagine winter as a time of stillness, and in some ways it was, but it was also a time of making. Within shelters, safe from the wind, hands stayed busy. Cordage was twisted from fibers. Nets were woven from gut. Tools were shaped from antler or bone. Hides were smoked, not just for preservation, but to keep them flexible and water-resistant. The smell of hide curing, sharp, earthy, would have mingled with wood smoke and cooked marrow. These were homes full of life, full of craft. Items weren't made in isolation. Someone told a story while scraping a hide. Someone else sang softly while boring holes into beads. The cold outside forced people inward, and from that closeness came creativity. Winter was not just about enduring. It was about investing in what would be needed when the world thawed. Inside that closeness, gestures became language. Not just words, but looks, signs, touches. When the wind howled too loud for speech, or mouths were covered against the cold, people relied on the eyes, the tilt of the head, the hand signal passed through shadow. These unspoken modes of communication deepened over time, creating tight bonds within groups. And when danger struck, when the fire went out, or an animal wandered too close, there wasn't time for discussion. There was instinct, trust, and a shared understanding built through countless quiet nights. In a way, winter didn't just push people together physically, it knitted them emotionally. The shared silence became its own kind of speech. The materials used in daily life also reveal ingenuity, adapted specifically for cold. Sinew, for example. Dried tendon was an extraordinary resource. It could be used for stitching, binding, or even stringing early bows. In cold, wet environments, sinew retained its strength better than plant fibers, and it could be prepared in advance and stored dry. Birch bark, too, was a kind of prehistoric miracle. Waterproof, flexible, and lightweight, it served as container material, fire starter, and even shelter covering in some regions. People knew which trees gave the best bark and when to harvest it so it peeled clean without damaging the tree. These weren't random choices. They were evidence of trial, memory, and respect for resources that gave back year after year. Among the most haunting remnants of Ice Age life are the footprints, literal and figurative, left in the snow and soil. In one now famous site in what is now New Mexico, A sequence of footprints preserved in ancient mud shows a young woman or adolescent carrying a small child, walking for miles, pausing at times, shifting the weight from one hip to the other. The prints are over 10,000 years old, and yet you can see the rhythm of care in every step. Who she was, where she was going, why she carried that child, we'll never fully know, but the action is universal. Someone carried someone else, through the cold, through the silence, through the unknown. Survival has always been carried on the backs of the devoted, and this devotion to one another, to the craft of living, to the rhythm of nature, is what echoes forward into us. We might think of ourselves as separate from these ancient people, but in truth, their winters live inside us. The instinct to gather close when the weather turns, to light candles against the darkness, to share food when supplies grow thin, it's all the same story. We inherit their endurance in our DNA, their attentiveness in our habits, their quiet courage in how we face the long seasons of our own lives. They didn't have to survive, but they did, and because of that, we get to remember. As we move deeper into the ancient winters of the past, something becomes clear. Survival wasn't always about conquest. It was often about surrender. Surrendering to the rhythm of the land, the mood of the weather, the silence of the dark. Instead of resisting the season, our ancestors adapted to it. They didn't fight the cold by trying to overpower it. They listened to it. They watched where animals burrowed. They noticed when the ice stopped creaking. They accepted stillness when the world went still. That ability to bend without breaking, to yield without giving up, it may be one of the oldest human strengths. And winter, with its deep hush and endless patience, was its teacher. In some ways, winter survival brought out the most refined aspects of human planning. Think of the stores that had to be built up before the snow came. Dried roots, nuts, smoked meat, rendered fat, stacked firewood, prepared tools, mended clothing. These weren't last-minute scrambles. They were the result of weeks, sometimes months, of collective labor. And if one part of the plan failed, if food spoiled, or someone got hurt, or predators raided a cache, the group had to adjust quickly. This flexibility, this willingness to reorganize and reprioritize under pressure, is what made the difference. And that mindset didn't disappear with spring. It carried forward into the way people approached everything from migration to ritual. Winter taught them not only how to prepare, but how to recover. Among the most revealing glimpses into Ice Age winters are the layered campsites, where traces of repeated occupation show up. Hearths rebuilt in the same spot, waste pits carefully filled, tool fragments clustered near fire remains. These weren't just one-time camps. They were seasonal homes, places of memory. Returning to them each year must have brought a strange sense of comfort. Here's where we sat last time. This is where the snowdrift always piles up. Don't step there. The ground's soft under the snow. Imagine arriving at a place buried in frost and remembering it in sunlight. That kind of seasonal memory is powerful. It binds people not just to each other, but to place. Even in a world without permanent structures, a camp could be a kind of homecoming. One detail that often goes unnoticed in these studies of the past is sound, how winter changed it. In cold, dense air, sound carries farther. A branch cracking underfoot, a whisper, a howl in the distance, all became clearer, sharper. For people living close together, that meant a heightened awareness. You could hear someone's breath in sleep. You could hear the pop of a fire from across a shelter. These sounds shaped emotion, comfort when they were familiar, alarm when they were strange. A sudden silence, the kind that falls before snow, might stop everyone in their tracks. In a world before language was written down, sound was a guide, a signal, a presence. It reminded people they were not alone, or warned them that something else was out there. Even the architecture of shelters, where known, reveals extraordinary adaptation. In regions where snow piled high, entrance tunnels were often dug below the surface of the snowline, with small cold traps, low areas where dense frigid air would settle. allowing warmer air to rise toward the sleeping spaces. This basic principle is used in modern winter tents, but our ancestors seem to have understood it intuitively, or at least through lived experience. Bones were used to frame walls, furs layered thick to block wind. In some cases, entrances were double-layered, a kind of primitive airlock, not to impress anyone, not to decorate, just to stay alive. And in that simplicity, there's something quietly brilliant, and as always, the quietest brilliance was in the way people treated each other. The ancient world wasn't a place of constant cruelty and competition, as some still imagine. The archaeological record tells a softer story, of shared hearths, of children carried, of broken bones healed, of elders honored. Winter exposed everything: weakness, fear, strength, love, and people responded by coming closer, huddling in the dark, sharing heat, trading stories, watching out for one another. In those months when the world went still and breath steamed in the cold, the human heart stayed warm, not through accident, through choice. It's easy to underestimate just how intelligent early winter survival strategies were, especially when viewed from the comfort of the modern world. But if you were to walk into a winter shelter from 30,000 years ago, you'd likely be struck by its order. Tools wouldn't be scattered randomly. Firewood would be sorted by size. Clothing and hides would be hung to dry away from the fire's sparks. Food would be placed where the warmth could preserve it, without spoiling it. In the dim light of a tallow lamp or glowing coals, you'd see that nothing was left to chance. Organization wasn't a preference, it was survival. Misplacing a tool, forgetting to rotate drying meat, allowing a child too close to the fire. Any of these small things could spiral into danger, so routines became sacred. Even when chaos pressed at the door, the inside had to remain calm. And that calm extended to rituals we're only beginning to understand. In some Ice Age sites, people arranged objects in symbolic ways: animal bones placed deliberately near hearths, small figurines buried under sleeping areas, or pigments smeared across stone in careful patterns. These weren't mistakes, they had meaning. Maybe it was protective, maybe it marked a birth or a successful hunt or the passing of someone loved. These actions helped organize experience in a world where so much remained uncontrollable. Winter especially, with its long nights and invisible threats, needed that kind of emotional structure. It wasn't enough to just eat and sleep. People needed to make sense of things. Ritual became a language deeper than speech, written in ash and bone and memory. One of the most astonishing examples of prehistoric winter endurance comes from Siberia, where human remains and artifacts have been found in some of the coldest, harshest environments on Earth. These weren't accidental visitors. They were established residents. Clothing recovered from frozen graves shows layering that rivaled modern cold-weather gear. Inner furs for insulation, outer hides for wind protection, stitched seams sealed with resin or sinew. Hoods, mittens, boots, all present, and in some cases even decorative elements were included. Beads, stitching patterns, dyed fibers. These weren't just about warmth, they were about dignity, about expressing identity, even when everything around you was monochrome and deadly cold. That impulse to say "I am me" even while fighting the elements is one of the most human things of all. Then there are the traces of play. Yes, play. In several sites, small objects have been discovered that serve no obvious survival function. Shaped stones that fit easily in the hand, carved animals too small to be tools, bone dice-like cubes with etched sides. These were likely toys or game pieces. Even in winter, when food was scarce and firewood precious, people made time for joy. Children needed distraction, adults needed relief. Maybe they played games to pass time during storms. Maybe they told riddles, or painted their faces with ash to make each other laugh. These moments, fleeting as they were, mattered. They reminded people that life was still happening, even while survival was the main concern. And those moments may have offered the exact kind of emotional fuel people needed to keep going. Let's not forget, too, the importance of animals beyond the hunt. While most creatures were feared or followed for food, Some were admired. The cave lion, the mammoth, the owl, these animals appear again and again in Ice Age art, not just in hunting poses, but in dreamlike forms. One of the most famous carvings from this period, the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadal, combines human and animal features into a single towering figure. It was carved out of mammoth ivory over 30,000 years ago, possibly during the depths of winter. What did it mean? Was it a god, a memory, a vision? Whatever its purpose, it shows that humans were not only surviving the cold, they were reaching beyond it. They were imagining. And imagination may have been the most powerful survival tool of all. With imagination, people could plan hunts, design better shelters, teach children through stories, and remember those who were gone. Imagination allowed them to see through the dark, beyond the snow, into a future that wasn't yet here. That's what winter demanded. Not just endurance, but foresight. Not just patience, but vision. When the world was quiet and bitter and still, it was the mind, the dreaming, adaptive, daring human mind that kept the fire burning. In the coldest months, when food was rationed, and every breath formed a cloud in the air. One of the most vital elements wasn't something you could hold or burn, it was memory. Not abstract memory, but practical living memory. How thick the river ice was last year. How many days the storm lasted. Where the sun first rose when it started to warm again. In the absence of written records, memory was passed mouth to mouth, gesture to gesture, task to task. Elders weren't only respected for their age, they were walking archives. If someone remembered which tree had bark that could burn wet, or where to find the cave with dry moss near the back wall, that knowledge could save lives. In winter, forgetting was dangerous, remembering was survival. And memory didn't live only in people, it lived in patterns, repeated across time. Think of the annual cleaning of hides, the first fat rendering of the season, the ceremonial lighting of the hearth as the cold set in. These weren't just chores, they were rhythms. They gave people something to rely on when the sky turned dark before dinner and the wind moaned through the cracks. Ritual and routine, often seen as opposite of innovation, were in fact part of how humans innovated wisely. They created stable spaces in which creativity could happen. You don't try a new way of drying meat unless you've already secured enough food to survive, if it fails. Winter sharpened that understanding. It demanded balance, structure, with just enough room for something new. Let's also talk about how music fit into this winter world. Bone flutes discovered in Germany, dating back over 40,000 years, play tones hauntingly close to modern scales. That means early humans not only made music, they recognized harmony. In long winter nights, music wasn't just entertainment. It was company, a lullaby to help a child sleep under shared hides, a low hum to mark the rhythm of scraping a hide, a group chant to bring people together before a hunt. Singing helped regulate breath, calm nerves, and bring people into sync, literally. In a world without clocks, a song could measure time, measure distance, or mark a memory. In some shelters, flute fragments were found alongside hearths, proof that where the warmth was, so too was the music. And then there's scent, a sense often overlooked in discussions of prehistory, but essential in cold environments. The sharp smell of pine, the must of damp fir, the sweetness of rendered fat, the smoke of slow-burning bark. These weren't just sensory details, they were information. People could smell when food was turning. They could smell when hides needed cleaning or when wood was too green to burn, and smell was deeply emotional. A certain scent might remind someone of a feast, a death, a migration, the shared smell of a winter shelter. The mix of people, smoke, tallow, earth, would have been uniquely comforting. It said, you are inside, you are safe, you belong. In that way, scent was memory's quiet cousin. Winter also shaped how people measured effort. When calories were precious, decisions had to be calculated. Was it worth walking 5 kilometers through snow to check a trap? Was it smarter to conserve energy and focus on reinforcing the shelter instead? These questions didn't just guide individual choices, they shaped group dynamics. People needed to trust that others were pulling their weight. A single slacker could threaten the whole group. But what's remarkable is how often early communities appear to have supported those who couldn't contribute. The elderly, the injured, the very young. That kind of social contract wasn't written. It was felt. Mutual care wasn't just kindness. It was strategy. And that strategy gave birth to the first societies. And through all of this, through memory, music, scent, calculation, ran one consistent thread: attention. Winter demanded attention to others, to the environment, to the body's signals, to the fire. And attention, over time, became tradition. It became knowledge. It became love, disguised as watching someone sleep, a little too close to the cold wall, and quietly moving a hide over them, or noticing someone's hands are chapped, and handing them a ball of fat to rub in, or sitting next to someone who hasn't spoken all day, and humming a tune from last season. This was the real strength of prehistoric winter life. Not brute force, but careful, steady, shared attention. The cold shaped everything, even the shape of rest. Sleep wasn't the single, unbroken stretch we imagine today. In long, firelit nights, people likely slept in phases, dozing early, waking for hours in the dark, and sleeping again just before dawn. Anthropologists call this segmented sleep, and it appears in many pre-electric societies. During those quiet midnight hours, people may have talked, thought, meditated, or shared stories. Some might have added logs to the fire, tended to babies, or carved beads by firelight. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness wasn't insomnia. It was a natural rhythm, one that winter invited. The long darkness gave people permission to rest in layers, to wake without panic, to let sleep unfold slowly, like smoke curling up into the rafters. And when people did sleep, they didn't sleep alone. Shared sleeping was not just common, it was essential. Families and groups huddled under heavy furs, bodies pressed close, warmth pooled like breath under a blanket. Children nestled between parents. The elderly may have been placed closest to the fire. Even animals, tame dogs or wolf companions, might have curled into that warmth. This was intimacy born of necessity, but it also created bonds. In that space, people learned each other's patterns, who twitched in dreams, who snored, who needed extra covering. It was safety through nearness. And in that stillness, in the shared rise and fall of breath, a different kind of language developed. No words, just the quiet agreement of being alive, together, through the dark. Sometimes, that darkness had to be moved through quite literally. Imagine a nighttime journey, taken out of need. Maybe someone fell sick, and another camp had medicine. Maybe a predator was stalking the edge of a shelter and needed to be driven off. Maybe food ran out. Whatever the reason, some winter nights required stepping into the cold. For this, torches were made, tightly bound reeds, or bark soaked in fat, lit and carried with care. Fire was never wasted, and its light meant exposure as much as it meant safety. These walks through snow and silence left marks, not just in footprints, but in memory. A dangerous journey completed became a story told again and again, proof of bravery, of devotion, of the will to move forward no matter how thick the dark. And through the deep dark, relationships were shaped not just by blood, but by choice. Partnerships, whether romantic or cooperative, had to function under intense conditions. There was no luxury for bitterness or prolonged tension. Harmony was more than nice, it was survival. Couples had to divide labor, care for one another, manage fire, food, and shelter together. Friendships formed in these winters may have run deeper than bloodlines, based on who showed up when the fire went out, who gave up their share of dried meat, who sat up watching for wolves while others slept. These bonds weren't recorded in symbols or carvings, but they held communities together more securely than any wall. Sometimes winter would break something open, a shelter damaged by wind, a hunt that went wrong, a fire that failed in the night, and how the group responded revealed their core. Moments like these, didn't create heroes in the way we think of them today. Instead, they created resilience. Not loud declarations, but quiet, consistent action. Fixing what was broken, sharing what was scarce, trying again. Resilience wasn't glamorous. It was persistent. It showed up when fingers were numb, when the last hide was damp, when everyone was tired. It said, "We go on anyway." And in many ways, that's what winter was. A classroom for resilience. It tested patience, creativity, relationships, and it asked again and again, can you stay kind when things are hard? And more often than not, the answer was yes. The evidence isn't found in grand monuments, but in small things. A repaired spear, a carefully stitched mitten, a child's toy placed in a grave. These quiet affirmations of life show us that even at the edge of survival, people reached for warmth, for connection, for care. Winter didn't harden them. It refined them. It brought forward the strongest parts of our shared humanity, not because they had a choice, but because they made one. Every day, every night, under every snow-covered sky. Sometimes, it's the absence of something that tells us the most about the past. In winter, silence was everywhere. Not just the quiet of snow-dampened ground, but the absence of birdsong, the stillness of trees, the long pauses between sounds. In that hush, people became more attuned to their own breath, to the creak of their joints, to the soft sighs of sleeping companions. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of tension, of awareness, of presence. It gave people space to think, to remember, to watch. It slowed everything down, and in that slow time, people may have found a deeper rhythm, one that modern life rarely allows. A rhythm where meaning didn't rush, but arrived, gradually, like light returning to the sky after months of darkness. In those long shadows, one of the more curious things to survive the centuries is pigment, red ochre, black charcoal, yellow clay. These were not necessities for staying warm or fed, and yet they show up everywhere, smeared on tools, painted on cave walls, brushed onto the bones of the dead. Red ochre especially seems to have held symbolic weight. Perhaps it stood for blood, or the setting sun, or warmth itself. In winter, when color drained from the world and everything turned white and gray, these pigments may have offered more than decoration. They offered contrast. They said, we are still here, we still create, we still see beauty. Whether painted on skin or sprinkled on snow, color was a rebellion against the cold's erasure of the vibrant world. And then, sometimes, people left behind entire compositions, like the cave paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux, though we can't say for certain when each image was painted. Some of them appear to have been created during cold periods, based on dating and climate records. That means people walked deep into stone passageways during the bitter season, torches in hand, pigments prepared, visions already forming. They crouched in near silence to draw mammoths, lions, deer, and symbols whose meanings we can only guess. Why do this in winter? Maybe because winter was when the outside world fell quiet enough to hear the inner one. Maybe because the act of painting, of lighting a torch and breathing life into a wall, felt like conjuring warmth, like calling spring forward with every careful line. Winter changed even the way people hunted. In warmer seasons, speed and stamina might have been the hunter's edge, but in deep snow, it was strategy. People learned to move in silence, to follow animals' behavior closely, to use the terrain to their advantage. In some cases, they may have driven prey toward snowdrifts, where movement became harder. Spears tipped with bone or flint were selected not just for sharpness, but for flexibility in the cold. Nets or traps may have been used when snow muffled footsteps. Cooperation was essential. A single successful hunt could feed a group for days, but only if every role was executed well. And afterward, the work began, butchering quickly before the meat froze too hard, preserving cuts with smoke or snow, sharing it in ways that would keep everyone strong. Even the architecture of thought shifted in the cold. People who lived closely with winter likely began to think in terms of cycles, not just seasons, but spirals of return. Life didn't move in a straight line, it circled back. The last snow, the last fire, the last story told before the thaw. This cyclical mindset appears in some of the oldest symbolic carvings, spirals, loops, repeated forms. It may have shaped belief systems. Death wasn't necessarily an end. It was part of the turning. Just as snow covered the earth, but always melted. Just as the sun left and always came back. Winter taught people to trust in return. That's a deep kind of hope, not blind optimism, but the earned faith of those who have endured before. And even when the body was tired, when the hands cracked and the fire burned low, people still reached for one another. Through gestures, through breath, through the simple act of showing up, someone woke early to stoke the coals. Someone gave up their portion of fat to a weaker child. Someone added a soft carving to a grave, or whispered a song while pressing a handprint to the wall. These are the moments that remain. They don't come to us through grand monuments, but through soot, stone, and the soft curve of a worn tool handle. They speak, if we listen, in the language of survival. Not the kind built on dominance, but the kind built on care. That's what winter preserved, and that's what we carry. If winter demanded endurance, it also demanded faith. Not in gods necessarily, but in patterns. In each other, in the next sunrise. Early humans may not have had words for what we now call trust, but they lived it. Every shared meal, every cooperative hunt, every night spent gathered under the same fir was an act of quiet belief. Belief that others would protect the fire, would not hoard food, would carry you if your leg gave out in the snow. That kind of trust didn't come from sentiment. It came from necessity. But it bloomed into something more. It became the foundation for relationships that lasted beyond a single season. Winter taught people how to rely, not just on strength, but on care. Within that care, memory lived in objects. A stone tool passed from parent to child. A fur cloak stitched with a pattern remembered from a grandmother's hands. A simple bracelet of bone worn through at the edges. These weren't just items. They were stories made solid. The more winter stripped away from the outer world, the more people seemed to pour meaning into the few things they kept close. A broken spear tip might be mended, not because it was easier than making a new one, but because it had been through something. Winter gave everything weight, not just physical, but emotional. The worn, the scarred, the imperfect. These became sacred. They were proof of continuity, of survival. And sometimes survival took the shape of imagination. In the cold months, when travel was limited and the hunt slowed, the mind turned inward. People dreamed. Some of the earliest known figurines, like the Venus of Willendorf, may have been shaped during winter. What she meant is still debated. Fertility, abundance, motherhood, memory. But what's certain is that someone, in the midst of cold and scarcity, shaped her with care. They had no modern language, no permanent shelter, no calendar, but they had the urge to make something that outlasted their hunger. That's not just survival, that's expression. That's the moment when endurance becomes something more, when humans rise beyond reaction, into reflection. Reflection likely happened most often around the hearth. The fire was more than warmth. It was the center of everything. Its light changed the look of faces, made the walls come alive, marked the border between inside and outside. People sat close, legs drawn in, sharing roasted roots or marrow scraped from bones. Over the fire, deals were made. Apologies were offered. Stories were retold for the 100th time, because in winter, repetition was comfort. There was no rush to move on. A child could ask, "Tell it again," and someone would. Because storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was how people taught, how they warned, how they loved. The fire made those words flicker in memory like shadows on the wall. The wall itself, sometimes, became the page. In places like Pec Merlo, ancient artists blew pigment around outstretched hands, creating stencils that still remain. A human hand smaller than yours, maybe a teenager's, frozen in red on stone for over 20,000 years. What was the impulse behind it? To mark presence, to connect with the spirit of the cave, to say I was here and I mattered. We may never know, but the moment lives on. A small act in a cold cave during a hard season, and still it speaks. That's what winter did. It pulled people inward, toward each other, toward imagination, toward meaning. Even in times of doubt, when a hunt failed, or someone fell sick, or supplies ran lower than expected, people still made space for hope. It may have been nothing more than keeping a spark alive under the ashes, or singing while the snow howled outside, or carving a spiral into bone while waiting for the storm to pass. Hope wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady, persistent. It looked like a group gathered around a shared fire, still breathing, still dreaming, still warming each other through the longest night. The more we learn about Ice Age communities, the clearer it becomes that winter didn't isolate people, it bound them. Cold pushed them closer together, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and socially. The shared challenge became a shared story, one that repeated every year with slight variation. The early frosts, the first snowfall, the longest night, the slow return of light. These annual events formed the bones of collective memory. Over time, they may have become ceremonial. Perhaps people marked the solstice with a special meal, or lit their fire in a certain way, or told a particular story only when the nights were longest. These rituals weren't grand or decorative, they were grounding. They made the cold familiar. They gave shape to the formless. That shaping extended to the spaces they built. Though many Ice Age people were nomadic, their winter shelters were anything but temporary in intent. Bones were arranged in careful circles. Hides were layered to insulate both heat and sound. Entryways were built to reduce wind. In some rare cases, remnants of interior partitions suggest sleeping areas, work areas, storage corners. These weren't just piles of fur in a cave. They were structured homes, thoughtfully arranged, gently maintained, continuously adjusted. Even the hearth wasn't always central. In colder climates, it was sometimes slightly offset to avoid smoke buildup or to warm a wall where people slept. These choices speak to years, maybe centuries of lived experience, passed down through action rather than explanation. Within these spaces, the sense of time slowed and deepened. Without clocks or external demands, people became acutely aware of their own rhythms. They knew when a wound was healing, not by the day of the week, but by how it looked, how it felt, how the body responded. They knew how long to roast marrow bones, not by minutes, but by smell and color. The sun and moon, the state of the fire, the hunger in the belly. These were the clocks of winter, and in that kind of timekeeping, people became more attuned to presence, to subtle changes, to quiet. That attentiveness didn't just make them better hunters or caretakers, it made them more aware of one another. When someone was withdrawn, or uneasy, or sick, it was noticed. Winter didn't allow indifference. In that same awareness, it's easy to imagine the special roles played by the dreamers, the people in each group who saw the world just a little differently. Every community likely had someone like this, the one who interpreted signs in the snow, or remembered the dreams of the dead, or felt a deeper connection to the unseen. These weren't necessarily leaders or healers, but something quieter, interpreters of meaning. They might have carved the first symbols into bone, or sung softly while everyone else worked, or insisted that a certain cave wasn't safe to enter, for reasons they couldn't quite explain. In winter, when the edges of the known world closed in, those dreamers may have helped people reach beyond it. They gave voice to the invisible, and sometimes that's what helped people keep moving forward. Children, too, were part of the winter rhythm. They didn't just wait to be taught, they watched closely. They copied tool use with smaller stones. They learned how to coil gut into cord by watching elders' hands. They mimicked snow tracking with eager, awkward steps, and they asked questions, sometimes with words, sometimes just with wide eyes and attention. Winter was not a pause in learning. It was its own kind of school, and when children weren't watching, they were inventing, turning bones into pretend spears, or scratching marks into dirt, or playing with the smoke that curled from the fire. These weren't distractions. They were rehearsal, exploration, preparation for the day they'd take their place beside the fire. Not as observers, but as contributors. And across all these scenes, the planning, the work, the rest, the rituals, there was always the waiting. Waiting for the thaw. Waiting for the sun to rise just a little earlier. Waiting for the ice to recede from the river's edge. That kind of waiting can wear a person down, but it can also stretch time, soften sharp edges, make people more grateful. Maybe that's why winter stories, the kind told when everyone was too tired to do anything else, lasted so long. Maybe that's why people painted on cave walls, even with cold fingers, not to pass time, but to honor it, to say, we are still here, still watching, still waiting, still together. The hardest part of winter wasn't always the cold. It was the monotony, the repetition, the sameness of sky, snow, and silence. When days blurred into one another, and the fire crackled just the same as it had the day before, and the food was familiar, maybe too familiar. People needed something else to survive, not physically, psychologically. And that's where imagination bloomed. Someone might carve a new pattern into a tool handle, not because it made the tool better, but because it made them feel better. Someone else might retell a story with new details, inventing as they went. A child might mimic an adult's posture with a stick and fur, pretending to be the lead hunter. These acts didn't make the cold go away, but they made it bearable. Play, art, invention. These weren't luxuries. They were how the soul stayed warm. That warmth spread through small moments, often unnoticed. A glance shared when a spark caught and fire took. A smile when someone added a new verse to an old song. A deep breath when the snow stopped falling and the silence outside grew softer. These little shifts, often fleeting, reminded people that change was still possible, that even in the stillest season, nothing was completely frozen. A trapped animal would still break free. A new idea would still arrive. A child would still learn a new word. These flickers of life, happening quietly in the background, were proof that movement never stopped. Not entirely. Winter didn't silence life. It just made it whisper. That whisper was heard most clearly in the things people chose to preserve. We know that food was dried, smoked, and cached. But stories were cached too, tucked away in minds, in firelight, in ritual. You can imagine an elder repeating the same tale of a great journey through snow, not just because it was tradition, but because it gave the group a sense of identity. We are the ones who came through that storm. We are the ones who crossed the ice. These aren't just memories, they're myths, foundational truths, shaped by experience, told and retold until they become something stronger than facts. In this way, winter helped people define themselves, not just by what they did, but by what they survived. Sometimes the greatest act of survival was rest. There's evidence that some groups intentionally slowed down their activity during winter, not because they were weak or idle, but because it was strategic. Less movement meant fewer calories burned, fewer risks, more preservation. People took their time skinning a hide. They sat longer by the fire after meals. They let the days pass without rushing to fill them. This kind of rest wasn't laziness. It was a choice, a communal slowing. And within that stillness, things settled. Grudges softened. Ideas developed. Skills sharpened. In modern life, we rarely stop moving, but these people did. Not just because they had to, but because they knew how. And in the quiet, when bodies were still and tools were set aside, there may have been dreams, deep, strange dreams, shaped by flickering shadows and the sound of snow melting on stone. Dreams of animals, of ancestors, of the sun returning. Some researchers believe that altered states of consciousness, brought on by hunger, rhythm, or even firelight, played a role in early spirituality. Maybe someone awoke and described a vision, a mammoth with glowing eyes, a red sky filled with wolves, a cave that sang when you entered it. And maybe the group listened, not with disbelief, but with respect. Winter opened the door to the inner world. When the outer world offered little movement, the mind moved inward and brought back stories. Stories that didn't end in winter, that were carried forward, told again the next year, and the next, until someone finally carved them onto bone, or painted them in red across the cave wall, until someone whispered them to a child falling asleep to the sound of wind outside the shelter, until we, thousands of years later, began to find them and wondered what they meant. And in that wondering, maybe we feel just a little closer, not just to the past, but to each other. There's something quietly profound about the idea that in the depths of winter, when the land seemed most barren, humans created some of their most meaningful connections to one another, to the earth, and perhaps even to something beyond themselves. It's easy to imagine that survival meant nothing more than brute endurance. But time and time again, what the evidence shows is something softer. These early people didn't just huddle for warmth, they reached for understanding. They made symbols, sang lullabies, carved spirals. They turned caves into memory, and through that, they left behind something far greater than just footprints or fire pits. They left behind the shape of thought, the evidence of emotion, the first traces of wonder. That wonder may have been strongest during the small moments no one thought to record. Like when a child traced their finger through ash and made a pattern in the dirt, or when someone noticed how the wind moved the smoke differently when it was going to snow. These weren't ceremonies or strategies. They were reflections of attention, simple, living awareness. It's that attention, sustained through hard seasons, that helped humanity grow into something more than a species of survivors. It made us observers, creators, teachers, caretakers. In the worst of conditions, people didn't just endure, they paid attention, and that attention turned into meaning. Even the act of listening, really listening, may have taken on a different depth in winter. In close quarters, when the fire crackled low and voices were tired, the difference between someone's usual cough and a new one meant everything. When food was limited, knowing when someone was truly full or just pretending to be changed how portions were shared. In that quiet, every sound was a message. Every glance carried history. And listening became not just a social habit, but a form of compassion. The stillness of winter sharpened the senses. Yes, but it also deepened empathy. When you live so close to others, their pain becomes yours. Their joy too. That closeness may have been winter's most powerful teacher. Pain was present, of course. Bones healed poorly. Teeth cracked. Fires went out. But even these moments were met with care. In some burials, individuals with severe injuries or deformities were laid to rest with the same tenderness as others. Sometimes more. Beads placed near their hands. Tools arranged beside their legs. These were not cast-offs or burdens. They were members of the group. Perhaps their stories were even more sacred, because they spoke of strength that wasn't just physical, because they had endured. Winter did not weed out the weak. It revealed a broader strength, the strength of a community that chose to carry, to protect, to include. By the time the snow began to melt, slowly, subtly, barely at first, people would have started to feel it in the softness of the soil beneath a toe, in the first drip from a tree branch, in the sudden sound of water under ice. These signs weren't small, they were sacred. Not because spring would instantly solve everything, but because it would begin to. It meant movement, renewal, choice. It meant change. And for people who had measured time by the tightness of their boots, the softness of their breath, the distance between hunger and fullness, change was everything. Winter didn't just pass. It let go, and people stepped forward, again into a world just beginning to open. Yet something from winter always stayed with them. Maybe it was a story, maybe a scar, maybe a new way of making fire, or a song no one had sung before. But winter never left empty-handed. It always gave something in return. Knowledge, wisdom, clarity, and those gifts would be carried through the spring and into the seasons ahead. Not as burdens, but as offerings. As proof, we made it through. We were cold, yes, but we were never alone. As spring crept in, and the sun lingered just a little longer on the horizon each day, the rhythm of life began to shift. But the shift was cautious, respectful. The memory of the cold was still fresh. No one rushed into the open. No one forgot the silence that winter had taught. Instead, people emerged slowly, blinking at the brightness, listening for the sound of meltwater, watching animals reappear on the edges of the thaw. This wasn't just a return to activity. It was a kind of rebirth. Every winter, people had shed a version of themselves, and what came back into the light was new, wiser, weathered, but still here. Shelters would be cleaned out, their fire-blackened ceilings carrying the story of another season survived. Furs would be aired, tools sharpened, gear packed away for movement. But it wasn't just the practical things that changed. The way people spoke shifted. The tone of their stories changed. There was more laughter, more movement, more risk, and with it, more joy. Children who had spent months in tight, smoky interiors ran in circles. Hunters, once cautious in snow, now moved confidently through soft earth. And still, beneath all of it, the lessons of winter remained. A glance at the sky, a touch of gratitude before eating, a new understanding of the value of warmth. In a way, spring made winter's lessons shine more brightly. Every bit of green that pushed through soil reminded people of what they'd protected and who they'd become. Survival was not just about escaping death. It was about preserving meaning. The bonds formed in cold months did not dissolve in sunlight. They grew stronger. You kept me warm. You shared your food. You woke to feed the fire. These memories stitched people together like thread through hide, and those stitches lasted. Not just for a season, but for generations. People told stories of winters past, not only as warnings, but as honor. They spoke of the storm that sealed the shelter for days, the hunt that nearly failed, the sickness that passed. These weren't just hardships, they were moments, carried in story, embodied in songs, etched into memory. Every group had its own oral library of winter, and each version shaped the group's identity, what they endured, what they learned, what they valued most. In that way, winter didn't just mark the land, it marked the people. And even when generations passed, and the storytellers changed, and the specific camps and names faded into time, something in those stories stayed steady. The fire in the center, the shape of people huddled close, the hands reaching out when someone coughed or cried. That basic image, human warmth defying a frozen world, never changed. It lives in us still, in the comfort of shared blankets, in the habit of watching a flame, in the quiet sigh of someone sleeping nearby. Our lives may look different now, but the instinct is the same. To survive, yes, but also to connect. Because that's what winter always taught, that survival alone wasn't enough. You needed others. You needed meaning. You needed memory. And in meeting those needs quietly, patiently, one frozen night at a time, our ancestors didn't just endure, they became human. Fully, richly, deeply. And we are still walking forward in the warmth they made, step by careful step, out of the cold. So here we are at the edge of winter, looking back, not just at the snow-covered shelters and silent hunts, but at the quiet strength woven through each of those moments. What began as a question, how did they survive the cold, has unfolded into something far more beautiful. We've seen how survival wasn't just about furs and fire. It was about memory, about ritual, about love, in its simplest and most durable forms, the kind that wraps a child in warmth, that keeps a fire burning overnight, that offers a story when there's nothing left to give. That kind of love is what carried us through the Ice Age, and it's still what carries us now. If you've stayed with me through this journey, whether you listened while falling asleep, resting, or just letting your thoughts drift, thank you. I mean that. Thank you for making space for this kind of storytelling, for being curious, for taking the time to slow down with me. These stories may be about people long gone, but in listening to them, we keep something alive. We remind ourselves of what really matters. That even in the harshest times, people reached for each other. They shared warmth. They left behind more than tools. They left behind each other. And as the seasons turned, and the snow melted, and the fires became smaller, and the days longer, those same people who crouched around ancient hearths stepped out into light again, carrying every lesson with them. They didn't just step into spring as survivors. They stepped into it as storytellers, as teachers, as dreamers. That's what winter gave them. Not just the scars, but the stories, the memory of making it through. And that's what we've been sharing together tonight. If you found this comforting, or if you learned something new, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. And if this kind of story helps you rest, helps you reconnect, or helps you wonder, consider subscribing. There's so much more to explore. So many ancient nights, so many quiet human moments left to uncover. Together. For now, I hope you're warm, I hope you're safe, and I hope you carry a little piece of this with you into tomorrow. Just as our ancestors once carried fire through the snow. From my little corner of time to yours. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.